When the First Succession War concluded in 2821, every successor state was on the verge of collapse. Dozens of systems had been abandoned, and uncountable millions left to starve so that the struggling war effort could continue. When the last offensive finally petered out, it was the hope of many that the ruling houses would use the peace to rebuild the ruined cities of the Inner Sphere, and return life to how things were under the Star League. Needless to say that this did not happen. No one in government was under any illusions. The fighting had stopped not because their neighbours wanted to make peace, but because they could no longer physically make war. The ability to wage war again was the first thing the Successor Lords pushed for. Every ounce of effort went into reconstructing the damaged weapons factories and rebuilding their battered militaries. You might suspect that this proved unpopular at home, leading to mass civil unrest, but in actuality, the interior regions of the successor states were largely behind the decision. A callousness had developed among the people of the Inner Sphere that meant they cared little for the suffering of their own citizens along the borders. They accepted the decision pragmatically, and passively went without in so many aspects just so that they could feel safe that the fighting would remain a distant concern, happening far outside their field of view. The sad fact was that so many had been killed or cut off along the borders that there weren't enough voices left to oppose them. Earlier in our history of the Second Succession War, we looked at the sorry state of the Inner Sphere militaries at the end of the last conflict in 2821. In this chapter, we will review the incredible rebuilding effort the Great Houses undertook over the 9 years since. The degree to which they were able to rearm is miraculous, considering the devastation unleashed following the fall of the Star League. By 2830, a further 7 systems had been depopulated for one reason or another. Since none of those were attacked that decade, we can reasonably argue that they were delayed casualties of the First Succession War, bringing the total number of dead systems up to 166. This was barely offset by a handful of new colonies founded in the 2820s, Fable and Kettering in the Federated Suns, Astrocascia and Santander out in the Periphery, and Achtur and Christinia were resettled in the Capellan Confederation and Draconis Combine respectively. Overall military industrial capacity had made a remarkable recovery to almost 82% of 2786 figures. Shipbuilding was just shy of 58%, though the vast majority of surviving naval yards were now entirely dedicated to constructing jump ships. Warships were virtually extinct. The Lyran Commonwealth remained the benchmark for the other nations, with the Free Worlds League producing around 72% of their output, the Draconis Combine around 66%, the Federated Suns 60%, the Capellan Confederation just 55%, and the Periphery as a whole 31%. Marik controlled the highest number of functioning shipyards at 9. Kurita and Steiner both had 8, Davion 6, Liao 5, and the Periphery states 4 between them. Surviving records from the dawn of the Second Succession War allow us to look in detail at the state of the Inner Sphere militaries in 2830. The overall number of regiments had recovered to around 80% of 2786 figures, though their equipment and condition was no doubt inferior. The industrial might of the Lyran Commonwealth actually allowed them to match their old numbers, but the others fell well short. More information is available on the BattleTech units, so we shall examine that branch of the military in greater detail. The BattleTech forces of the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery had doubled in size since the end of the First Succession War, back to just over 80% of their former strength. They had founded only a single additional regiment in the last 9 years, bringing them to a total of 134. Average readiness levels were around 89%. The DCMS can be broken down as follows. Closest to Terra were the Davion regulars, primarily deployed against the Lyrans, with less focus on their rimward border. The Benjamin regulars supported them, splitting their forces equally between Davion and Steiner fronts. The Galladon and Razelhaig regulars faced off against the Federated Suns and Lyran Commonwealth respectively. The Pest regulars had been redeployed to their Periphery border, still fearing the return of the Stalag Defense Force in the wake of the Minnesota tribe. The Anting Legion and Sunzang Academy Cadre were almost exclusively deployed to the Galactic South, with a few garrisons on important capitals. The Arkab Legion had arrayed 2 regiments each against Davion, Liao, and Steiner, while the Proserpina Hussars focused only on the former. The elite Sword of Light Brigade was likewise aimed primarily at the more aggressive Federated Sons, with only the 8th Sword of Light up by the Tamar Pact. The Capellan Confederation armed forces had already launched a major offensive and suffered a humiliating counterattack before our detailed records begin in 2830. They may have also doubled in size were it not for their fresh losses, but as such fell just short of that target. They had recovered to almost 78% of the CCAR from 2786, and the average regiment was at 87% strength. The mutiny of 2 units and the loss of 1 more in combat the previous year gave them a total of 106 mech regiments. The Tikhanov Lancers were the most forward-placed brigade, primarily deployed to face the Draconis Combine and Free Wills League. Covering their flank were the Chesterton Reserves, formerly the Chesterton Regulars, spread between the 3 commonalities along the Terran end of the Federated Sons border. The majority of the Liao Guards were ready to respond to any Free Wills aggression. The Capellan Chargers had been entirely wiped out during the First Succession War, leaving the Liao Lancers and a pair of reserves to provide protection for the forward half of the Confederation. The Andurian Hussars and St. Ives Armoured Cavalry were deployed within their respective commonalities. The Cyan Dragoons were positioned along both their right flanks, split between the Davion and Marik border, while a handful kept watch over the Periphery. The Confederation Reserve Cavalry was spread out to bolster any weak points in their border defense. The Capellan Hussars still served as the nation's elite, and as such were focused in the forward half of the realm where fighting was expected to be thickest. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces had done the impossible and now fielded almost 2.1 times as many battle mechs as they had at the end of the last war, fractionally more than they had at the beginning of the previous conflict, the only nation to have increased their mech count. It's worth stressing again that many of those battle mechs were in a sorry condition, often rebuilt from salvage, unlike the pristine forces of 2786. In addition to those units raised by Hempstead to defend against the chain gangs, the Arcturan Guards, Donegal Guards, and Sky Rangers had all reformed one of their destroyed formations, bringing the LCAF total to 134 regiments and the Stealths Battalion. Average readiness sat at just under 90%. The Sky Rangers were the closest to Terra, all stationed within their home federation. The Hesperus Guards remained nearby to defend that key installation. Other brigades that were clustered together included the Donegal Regulars along the Free Wills League border, the Sakhalin Regulars along the Draconis Combine one, and the elite Royal Guards around the capital of Tharkad. The small Odessa and York Regular brigades, as well as the Stealths, were mainly garrisoning the Tamar Pact to protect from Kuritan aggression. The Arcturan Guards, all 5 divisions of the Lyran Guards, and the Lyran Regulars were scattered across the realm, in place to defend any local objectives or exploit a weakness in the enemy line. The Donegal Guards were similarly spread all across the Spinward half of the Commonwealth. The Free Wills League military may have matched their Lyran neighbours' growth in percentage terms, but they were down to just 78% of their First Succession War peak, a mere 103 regiments with an average strength of 91%. The minor provinces of the Syrian Concordance and Border Protectorate lay nearest to Terra, with their few mech forces close at hand. The solitary Marik Guard was only a few jumps away, and the Stuart Dragoons were likewise clustered in that corner of the League. Spread along the forward half of the Capellan border were the Oriente Hussars. The Orloff Grenadiers were responsible for incursions from the Sarna and Capella commonalities, the Fusiliers of Oriente watched over the Cyan commonality, and the Defenders of Andurian kept an eye on their Confederation counterparts. The Bolan defenders were one of the casualties of the First Succession War. As such, the Regulan Hussars had redeployed the majority of their brigade to the Lyran Commonwealth border, supported by most of the elite Freewells guards. The Atrian Dragoons and Marik militia were spread all along both hostile borders, with a few of the latter in position to watch the Periphery. Like the Capellans, the armed forces of the Federated Sons had already undertaken a large campaign by 2830, so it's impossible to tell just how much they rebuilt in the interwar years, but it was at least by a factor of 1.9. This gave them a paltry 72% of their former battlemech strength, equivalent to just 108 regiments and an additional 5 training battalions, with the average unit sitting at around 91% readiness. The Federated Sons was the only realm not within a single jump of Terra. Closest were the Arcadian Cuirassiers around Chesterton. Also in that heavily contested corner of Davion territory were 2 brigades of SLDF heritage, the Crucis Lancers and Deneb Light Cavalry. The latter had recently added a 6th regiment to their rolls, and the Clovis Guards had been rebuilt to defend their homeworld too. The Robinson Chevaliers had responsibility for the rest of the Kuritan border, backed by the Draconis March militia. The Robinson Rangers had not survived the First Succession War. The Tancredi Loyalists were posted near the tri-point of the 2 successor states and the Outworlds Alliance. On the Liao front, the Syrtis Fusiliers were the main strength along the border, supported by the Seti Hussars. The Dragon Lords had also redeployed half their brigade from the Taurian front to assist. In reserve were the Capellan March militia. The Syrtis Hussars had also been victims of the First Succession War. The largest AFFS brigade remained the Avalon Hussars, spread along both fronts, as were the smaller Avalon borderers. The New Avalon training cadre had dispatched many of their students to help defend against House Kurita, while the Albion Military Academy kept theirs in reserve. The Sakara training cadre had been reduced to just 5 battalions, still facing off with the Combine. The elite Davion Guards were at key positions across the Federated Sons. Deeper inside Davion territory were the Crucis March militia and lastly the Argyle Lancers. Loyalty across the Innisphere militaries was mixed, with the underwhelming performance demonstrated by the CCAF and LCAF since the fall of the Star League giving them many questionably committed regiments. Paul Davion's brilliant counter-offensive meant few in the AFFS were not behind him. The DCMS, as you might expect, exhibited the greatest number of fanatical units, whereas the CCAF and LCAF were again lacking. In terms of quality, Davion again came out ahead with by far the fewest number of untried green forces. Steiner, by contrast, had rushed many through training, as had Kurita and Liao to a lesser extent. If the Lyrans could be pleased about anything, it was the number of veteran and elite-rated regiments at their disposal. The Combine and Fed Sons came close, but the Confederation was definitely lacking. Adding considerable strength to the Great House militaries were the ever-increasing number of mercenary groups spread across the Innisphere and Periphery. The final years of the First Succession War saw a sharp increase in the amount of raids conducted by mercenary forces. The successor states preferred to keep their own troops in garrison, while disposable mercs were dispatched to hit targets of opportunity. Conversely, some states liked to use mercenaries to temporarily guard a flank, while they redeployed for a major campaign of their own. The Draconis Combine had secured 8 regiments and an additional 7 battalions for their own use. Unlike the other realms, there were no multi-regimental units in their employ, the largest being the 5 battalions belonging to the Amphigean Light Assault Group. The Capellan Confederation made use of a far greater number of mercenaries, 16 regiments and 1 additional battalion. Among their number was the largest group still in existence, the Northwind Highlanders. The 12th Star Guard, which had recently dropped its Star League organisation, was another large unit, as were the Always Faithful. In 2830, Liao hired both the Lakadan Vengeance Legion and the Grave Walkers, though it would take time for the latter to redeploy from the magistracy of Canopus. The Lyran Commonwealth had the fewest mercenaries to call upon, at just 10 regiments. The Filthy Lucre were the newest among them, while the largest and oldest were the Elysian Lancers, veterans of not just the Succession Wars, but the Star League Civil War before it. The Freewells League had acquired 11 regiments and 1 battalion for their use. Among them were some of the finest soldiers to have remained behind after Kerensky's exodus, the SLDF's 3rd Regimental Combat Team, the Eredani Light Horse. Their other large mercenary unit, the Crater Cobras, had consolidated their forces into just 2 regiments following losses along the Andurian front. The Federated Sons were the largest employer of mercenaries, a trait they share with their modern counterpart here in 3025. In total, they had 18 battlemech regiments at their disposal, including the newly formed Kurgawa's Blood Lances and Tamara's Black Sword. Davion had a trio of larger mercenary groups, the Blue Star Irregulars, Fighting Urukai, and Lexington Combat Group, each possessing 3 mech regiments. Like the Crater Cobras, the Screaming Eagles had condensed their forces into just 2 units. Combining house troops and mercenaries together gives us our grand totals for the successor state militaries. The Draconis Combine and Lyran Commonwealth were almost exactly equal, with equivalent strength to 130 factory-fresh battlemech regiments. On the other end of the spectrum were the Capellan Confederation and Freewells League, at a hypothetical 105 regiments, while the Federated Sons was the middle power at 118. In 2830, all-out war would return to the Inner Sphere, as every successor state turned on their neighbours. Some had already done so willingly, whereas others would be manipulated into it. The great houses would soon discover that the near parity in numbers shown on their paper TOEs hid the truth that their rebuilt forces could not withstand the ferocity of the renewed conflict. Heavy attrition would soon see their military strength drop to unprecedented lows, and continue to plummet throughout the Second Succession War. And there we have it, guys. That's the military overview out of the way. We can now begin the conflict in earnest. Over the next 8 chapters, we'll get to see how all those forces we just listed engage one another and how they fared. And we'll have one more at the end just to summarize everything and go over the extreme losses that they're going to suffer. It's difficult to gauge losses in comparison between the first 2 wars because there was probably a lot more rebuilding going on in the first. They still had that capability, but that would drop off drastically in the second conflict. Certainly, they're going to end up with far fewer forces available to them than they did back in 28-21. This episode ended up being an absolute nightmare to edit. I thought at one point it was going to take less than 2 days to get it done, and it ended up taking the whole week, and I'm really not that happy with the way it looks in the end. Yeah, some of the zooming in and panning across the realms, it was done with the intention of showing more the areas to which the different brigades were deployed, as opposed to the specific planets, which you can look at the full detail map that's linked in the description if you want to see everything. But that ended up taking an absurd amount of time to edit and render all those different maps. Yeah, it was absolutely not worth it, and I really don't even think I like the end effect. But whatever, hopefully you could follow along what was happening. Like I said, next time we're getting into the conflict in earnest. The first 2 chapters, what am I saying first 2? The next 2 are going to be the kind of fighting that we'll see is much akin to what we saw in the first. Maybe not quite as many WMDs getting thrown around, but we're seeing a similar kind of ferocity and scale to the fighting. We won't get ahead of ourselves by discussing it now, but after that there's a specific event which marks a kind of turning point in the Second Succession War, when everybody kind of wakes up to the reality that, oh, we just can't continue like this, and we need to radically shift our priorities and what it is we're trying to achieve with this conflict. Thank you once again for watching. As ever, if you enjoyed the video and want to support the channel, you can leave me a like, you can leave me a comment, they both help with the algorithm. I enjoy reading all your comments, try to respond to as many as I can. There's a Patreon link in the description below. If you want to see more videos like this one, subscribe, because like I said, there's another 9 chapters in this series still to go, and I'll have a lot more coming after that as well. Thanks once again, and I'll see you soon for another video.